Is there like latent fear in interacting with her that they say something wrong, like call her Meghan Markle instead of...
Before Dawn reached London, an extraordinary instruction was already moving through the royal household. Portraits connected to Meghan were to disappear from royal residences before the public woke. No ceremony, no explanation, no gradual transition. King Charles had made the decision, and staff were expected to carry it out immediately. But as frames began coming down behind closed doors, one question became impossible to ignore. What had pushed the king this far? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles had not ordered one photograph moved from one private room. He had ordered every displayed portrait of Meghan removed overnight from royal residences, including family images kept in ceremonial corridors and semi-private household spaces. A royal residence is simply a home or official property used by the monarch and senior members of the family, but these buildings also carry enormous symbolic weight. What hangs on their walls quietly tells visitors who belongs, who matters, and who remains part of the royal story. Two aides entered a Windsor corridor carrying padded cases. One lifted a framed family photograph from its hook, while the other checked a handwritten inventory. The action was careful, almost ordinary, yet that made it harsher. An image tied to years of family history had become an item to be logged, packed, and removed before breakfast. The timing was deliberate. Charles wanted the operation completed before staff rotations, visitors, or morning engagements could interrupt it. The king remained alone long after his advisors left. He pressed his fingers against the tabletop and stared toward an empty chair, fully aware that he had crossed a line. This was no longer an argument managed through statements or distance. He was changing the visible boundaries of the family itself, and he knew Harry would understand the message instantly. Harry did. When the Duke of Sussex learned that Meghan's image was being removed, disbelief hit first, then anger. He asked whether the order concerned one portrait, perhaps one room, perhaps one residence. The answer made everything worse. The instruction reached across multiple royal properties. To him, this was not redecorating. It felt like his wife was being erased from the spaces that once claimed her as family, and Harry was determined to discover what had finally changed inside. By sunrise, the walls had changed, but the deeper wound now belonged to Charles, Harry, and Meghan, because the question was no longer what had been removed. It was why the king had chosen this moment to do it, and the answer reached back to a confrontation that had been building for months. The portraits were only objects, yet nobody involved experienced their removal that way. For Charles, they represented a family relationship that had become increasingly difficult to reconcile with royal duty. For Harry, they represented his wife, his marriage, and years of accumulated resentment. And for Meghan, learning that her image had vanished from royal walls carried a brutal symbolism. Whatever remained privately, the institution was visibly drawing a line. Charles felt the conflict sharply. As sovereign, the king carried responsibility for protecting the monarchy's public stability. A sovereign is simply the reigning monarch, the person at the head of the crown. As a father, however, he remembered Harry as the boy who had grown up inside those same residences. Every order now collided with memories that no protocol could erase. That was why the portraits had survived earlier tensions. Removing them too soon would have turned private pain into an unmistakable public judgment. Meghan heard the full scale of the decision from Harry. She sat beside him without interrupting as he explained that the removals stretched across multiple royal properties. Then she asked one question. Had Charles ordered it personally? When Harry said yes, she went still. The hurt was controlled, but unmistakable. Those photographs had once suggested that, despite distance and argument, some thread of belonging remained. Now even that quiet symbol had been taken away. Harry could not stay seated. He walked across the room, stopped, then returned, and said what had been building inside him since hearing the news. This felt aimed at him too. The Duke of Sussex, Harry's royal title as the younger son of the king, saw the decision as another boundary drawn around his marriage. Meghan answered carefully. She told him not to react in anger, because anger would allow others to define the moment before they did. William made the silence worse. The Prince of Wales, the title traditionally held by the heir to the throne, already knew about the order, yet he had not told his brother whether he supported it, opposed it, or simply stayed out of the way. Harry noticed that silence immediately. Meghan did too. Neither could decide whether it meant caution or consent. Charles had resisted this path before. He had rejected earlier suggestions to reorganize family photographs, insisting that personal images should never become weapons in a royal dispute. His reversal, therefore, carried a deeper message. Something specific had broken his resistance. Weeks earlier, one private gathering had ended with Charles leaving without saying goodbye. To understand why the king finally gave the order, the story must return to that evening, when one exchange turned simmering tension into a point of no return. Every family rupture has a moment that later feels inevitable. In this story, it happened during a private Windsor gathering, weeks before the portraits came down. The evening had begun quietly, with no cameras and no public ceremony. Yet one conversation involving Charles, Harry, and Meghan changed the emotional temperature completely. Words that might once have been dismissed as frustration landed differently now, and the king carried them with him long after the room emptied. Charles arranged the meeting because he wanted the pressure contained before another disagreement escaped into public view. William joined him in person, while Harry and Meghan appeared remotely for part of the discussion. Windsor mattered. The royal residence is one of the monarch's principal working and private properties, where personal history and royal duty collide. The purpose was simple: establish boundaries around private conversations, palace life, and future references to the family. Meghan did not raise her voice when the discussion turned to photographs, but her words changed the room. She argued that displaying family portraits while limiting her and Harry's institutional access felt performative. By institutional access, she meant their formal connection to royal duties, offices, and privileges in the royal system. Charles stiffened, placed his pen down, and asked whether she truly believed those photographs had become meaningless. She answered that symbols could not replace trust. Harry backed his wife immediately. The Duke said photographs could not repair a relationship that felt distant behind closed doors. Charles heard something harsher. To him, his son was dismissing a visible sign that the family connection still mattered. Meghan tried to explain the difference, but the king had already gone quiet, and that silence carried more weight than anger. William remained after the call ended. Charles turned to his elder son and asked what he thought. The prince paused before answering that symbols only work when everyone accepts what they represent. He did not attack Harry or defend Meghan. He refused to mediate, and the restraint unsettled his father even more. Charles could not forget the exchange. Over the following days, he asked aides for inventories showing where Sussex family photographs remained displayed. He approved nothing at first. That delay made the decision more ominous, because the king was no longer reacting, he was deciding what the symbols meant. Finally, Charles reached his conclusion. If those portraits were being treated as hollow gestures, he would not preserve them merely to maintain appearances. But before issuing any order, he wanted Harry to hear the reasoning directly. The portraits were still hanging when father and son entered the same room again, but both men understood that the next conversation could determine whether they stayed there. There were no courtiers to soften the words, and no cameras to force restraint. When Charles and Harry finally spoke privately, the disagreement was no longer about photographs. It was about loyalty, memory, humiliation, and who had the right to define what remained of their fractured family. The king wanted clarity. His younger son wanted acknowledgement. Neither man entered intending to surrender, and within minutes, years of unresolved anger had entered the room with them. Harry stepped into a small sitting room, away from the formal offices, and immediately understood that this conversation would be different. Charles had asked that every aide remain outside. A courtier is a member of the royal household who works closely around the sovereign. But tonight there would be no one present to soften a phrase, redirect an accusation, or later take responsibility for what either man said. The king wanted the words to belong entirely to them. Charles raised the Windsor exchange first. He told his son that Meghan's earlier description of family photographs as performative had changed something fundamental for him. Those portraits, he said, had never been meant as decoration alone. They had represented continuity when the relationship itself had become strained. Harry answered that the problem was not the photographs. The problem was the distance behind them. Harry's restraint broke. He stood and accused the institution of deciding who belonged through access, titles, invitations, and symbols. Charles stayed seated until his son finished. then answered with a calmness that felt sharper than shouting. The monarchy, he said, could not keep displaying an image of unity while being told that the unity itself was false. Harry stared at him, realizing the conversation had moved beyond hurt feelings. Charles reached toward a folder containing inventories from several royal residences. A residence inventory is simply an internal record showing what objects are displayed or stored in each property. He placed one hand on the cover, then closed it without reading a page. "The matter is finished," he said. Harry understood immediately. The decision had not yet been announced, but emotionally, it had already been made. Harry asked one final question. Had William encouraged this? Charles did not answer. That silence landed almost like confirmation, even though the prince's actual role remained unclear. His younger son waited, but the king gave him nothing more. Harry walked out believing he had witnessed a father's anger. Minutes later, Charles summoned his private secretary, the senior aide who helps manage the monarch's official business, and authorized the overnight removal. The private rupture was becoming royal action, and once the order began moving through the palace, there would be no easy way to pull it back again. Royal power rarely announces itself with shouting. Sometimes it appears as a short instruction passed from one office to another until dozens of people begin moving without explanation. That was what made Charles's decision so formidable. A deeply personal wound had entered the machinery of the monarchy, and by midnight, staff were treating photographs, inventories, storage rooms, and residence protocols with the precision normally reserved for matters of state. Charles had already signed off on the instruction when senior household officials received it. The directive identified which displayed images were to be removed from active royal residences and required each location to complete the change before normal morning operations began. In this fictional scenario, the sovereign's domestic authority means the monarch controls practical household arrangements inside occupied royal properties, including what is displayed in rooms used by the family. That gave the king the power to act quickly, but not without consequence. Camilla found him after the order had begun moving through the household. She noticed the exhaustion before he spoke and asked whether he was certain. Charles answered that certainty was no longer the issue. Consistency was. The queen consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, warned that removing every image could look harsher than quietly rearranging a few private spaces. He replied that leaving the photographs untouched after the Windsor confrontation would now feel dishonest. William received confirmation only after the decision was final. He read the short message twice, placed his phone down, and understood exactly what his father had done. The prince had been informed, not consulted. That distinction mattered because it kept him from becoming either supporter or obstacle. Charles had chosen to carry the burden alone, and William could not decide whether that showed strength or isolation. At Balmoral, one aide stopped when an older family photograph created an unexpected problem. The image included Meghan, but it also included several other royals. Removing it meant taking everyone in the frame out of view. Balmoral, the royal family's private Scottish estate, carried deep family memory, so even a small change there felt unusually personal. The aide hesitated, then called for clarification rather than assume how absolute the order was. By morning, the consequences could no longer hide inside paperwork. Empty hooks, shifted frames, and altered tables made the decision visible to people who had never heard the private arguments behind it. And once staff noticed those absences, silence itself became dangerous, because someone outside inner circle was certain to notice. Charles had issued the command like administration, but daylight was about to reveal its true weight, an emotional declaration written not in words, but in absence. Morning did not bring confrontation, it brought absence. A photograph once placed beside a silver clock was gone. Another frame had vanished from a corridor console. Staff who had passed the same images for years suddenly noticed pale spaces where objects had stood. The overnight order had accomplished exactly what Charles intended, but as the household absorbed the change, the emotional force became harder to contain. Housekeepers entered Windsor's working rooms and noticed the differences immediately. Aides exchanged careful glances, while security staff said nothing. Windsor Castle is both a royal residence and a working base for the monarch, so changes inside its occupied rooms carry meaning beyond decoration. By mid-morning, Buckingham Palace working areas, Sandringham, and other residences named in the instruction had confirmed that Meghan's portraits were now in secure household storage. William slowed beside one table and stopped. The Prince of Wales looked toward the space where a Sussex family photograph had stood, then adjusted one remaining frame before walking on. He understood why Charles had acted, but understanding did not make the result easier to absorb. The absence felt final in a way arguments never had, and the future king knew everyone who noticed it would reach the same conclusion. Charles entered the room later and instinctively looked toward the missing photograph. The king said nothing for several seconds. He had approved lists, given authority, and insisted on consistency. But now the decision stood before him as something painfully simple. An empty place where family had once been represented. He looked away, yet the silence suggested the cost had finally become real inside the monarchy. Then secrecy began to crack. One staff member mentioned the overnight changes outside the inner household, and the details started moving beyond the residence. The palace understood the danger immediately. A private household decision could become a public symbol within hours, and once that happened, no explanation could fully control what people believed it meant. Meghan chose restraint when she learned questions were circulating. She refused to issue an angry statement, telling Harry that the empty spaces could speak louder than accusation. He wanted to respond, but she urged him to wait. Her calm deepened his frustration, because the Duke still felt the removals were aimed at both of them. Harry made one different choice. Before the story reached the press, he sent Charles a brief request for one final private conversation. Not as a prince addressing a king, but as a son addressing his father. The palace expected headlines next. Instead, the next decisive moment would happen behind a closed door, where both men had to decide whether anything personal could survive what had now become institutional. After the anger came something more difficult: honesty. Harry did not ask for the portraits to be restored. Charles did not offer to reverse the order. For once, neither man entered the conversation trying to win. They spoke without advisors and without arguments about constitutional roles. What remained was painfully simple: a father who believed boundaries had become necessary, and a son who believed those boundaries had become indistinguishable from rejection. Harry requested the meeting himself. The Duke asked to speak privately before any public response was released, and that surprised Charles because the message contained no demand, no threat, and no accusation. The king agreed, but on one condition: they would not argue about titles, security, media strategy, or palace protocol. Constitutional roles simply refer to the formal duties and limits attached to the monarchy. But Charles wanted those questions left outside. This conversation would be personal. Harry spoke first. He told his father that seeing Meghan removed from royal spaces felt like proof that the family had accepted permanent separation. His anger began firmly, but grief slowly entered his voice. The Duke admitted that what hurt most was not the absence of a photograph. It was the fear that every remaining connection could now be reduced, removed, or redefined whenever the palace decided circumstances had changed. Charles listened without interrupting. When the king finally answered, he said the order was never meant to erase a marriage, shared history, or family ties. It was meant to stop the monarchy from displaying a closeness that no longer existed in practice. He did not apologize for making that distinction. But he admitted something Harry had not expected. Issuing the order had caused him pain too. Harry could have left then. He almost did. Instead, he sat back down. Charles reached for a glass bottle and poured water into 2 glasses himself. An ordinary gesture that briefly stripped away rank, protocol, and years of public conflict. Father and son remained seated in silence before continuing, and that silence felt different from the one that had ended their previous confrontation. Charles finally drew the line clearly. Meghan's portraits would remain absent from official royal residences, but he refused to describe her as erased from the family. Harry accepted that institutional representation and private connection no longer had to mean the same thing. It was not reconciliation. It was something smaller, but real: recognition. Then the outside world intervened. Within hours, details of the overnight removals began leaking publicly. Father and son had found a narrow piece of common ground. But outside the palace gates, the empty frames were about to become a global symbol neither man could control. By midday, a private household decision had become international spectacle. Commentators debated whether the removals represented discipline, cruelty, closure, or simple acceptance of reality. Yet one image dominated everything. Not Meghan herself, but the space where her photograph had once stood. Suddenly, royal watchers were no longer discussing a family disagreement. They were discussing whether the monarchy had just created the most visible symbol yet of the Sussex separation. The story spread faster than the palace could contain it. Broadcasters connected the overnight changes across several royal residences, while newspapers treated the coordinated timing as proof that the instruction had come from the highest level. Palace communications, the official system used to handle statements and media responses, remained deliberately controlled. Officials refused to expand on private household display decisions, and that silence allowed the symbolism to grow larger than any formal explanation. A London newspaper captured the mood with brutal simplicity. Its front page showed an illustrated empty gilded frame against a palace wall beneath the words, "Out of the picture." Copies appeared outside Windsor Castle as television crews broadcast live, and the image quickly became the shorthand for the entire dispute. What had begun as an internal decision was now being interpreted as public exile. Charles saw the coverage before noon. The king paused over the morning press summary, studied the front page, then folded it closed without comment. A press summary is the daily briefing that gathers major media coverage for senior royals. He had intended the removals to create internal clarity, not turn his family into a public verdict. Yet the monarch knew that reversing course simply because the headlines were painful could make the decision look weaker and more personal. Harry wanted to answer immediately. Watching the coverage beside Meghan, he became furious when commentators described the removals as total rejection. She stopped him before anger became a statement, reminding him that his private conversation with Charles had produced something the public could not see: a distinction between family connection and institutional representation. The Duke hated the headlines, but he understood her warning. William reinforced that same distinction when he spoke privately with his father. The prince told Charles that the palace should neither humiliate Meghan further nor pretend the removal meant nothing. The household had changed because the relationships had changed. That, he argued, was enough. The world demanded explanation. Harry demanded dignity. The palace demanded consistency. And now Charles faced the final choice: restore the portraits under pressure, or leave the empty spaces untouched and accept exactly what they would mean. By evening, everyone understood that whatever he chose would become the lasting verdict on the fracture his order had exposed. In the end, Charles did not reverse the order. The portraits remained in storage, the walls remained changed, and the monarchy moved forward with a boundary that could no longer be misunderstood. Yet the meaning was more complicated than victory or punishment. Nobody truly won. A king established clarity. A son confronted separation. A woman watched royal symbolism disappear overnight, and a family finally stopped pretending that distance was temporary. Charles held his position despite criticism and private discomfort. The king knew that restoring Meghan's portrait simply to calm the headlines would turn the original decision into empty theater. Royal representation, meaning the way members of the family are formally presented inside official royal spaces, had changed because the relationships themselves had changed. He made clear privately that the order concerned active displays only. Archived photographs, historical records, and Harry's marriage would remain untouched. Meghan responded with restraint rather than triumph or anger. She told Harry that she did not want her portraits returned through reluctant compromise. If those images no longer represented an honest connection with the institution, she preferred the painful clarity of absence to symbolic inclusion without trust. The choice hurt, but it also gave her control over what the moment meant. Harry struggled longer. The Duke had spent days seeing the removals as rejection, yet he finally understood that forcing photographs back onto palace tables would not restore the relationships behind them. He could demand a frame. He could demand a statement. He could not demand closeness. Meghan's calm helped him accept that distinction, even when the truth remained painful. Days later, Charles entered the same Windsor room where one portrait had once stood. He paused beside the vacant section of the table and looked at the photographs that remained. The monarch felt the sadness of what had been lost, but he did not hesitate. His decision had become something larger than one person. The family would no longer use images to suggest a unity that private reality could not support. That became the final verdict. The overnight order did not heal Charles, Harry, or Meghan. It did something colder but clearer. It acknowledged separation without pretending separation meant erasure. The king kept his authority. She kept her dignity. His son accepted that his relationship with the monarchy had entered a permanently different form. The portraits remained gone, the decision stood, and the message was final. The monarchy had stopped displaying the family it once hoped to preserve, and begun accepting the family that actually remained. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.